Nice to welcome you all. Thanks for being here. It's my pleasure to welcome you and to especially welcome our speaker for today's sociology seminar, Lois Lee from the University of Kent. She's in the Department of Religious Studies there. She's a senior lecturer, and actually she did her PhD here and her MPhil, I believe. It's a bit of a homecoming, I think. She's already told me legends of the department, such as that Anthony Giddens' office is now the loo, right here. So I didn't know that.
You didn't hear it from me.
Yeah, so interesting stories. And I think it's really a pleasure to have Dr. Lee here today with us, because she's really one of the world-leading scholars in the field of religious and secular studies. She's worked on it for many years, and she has really contributed to the field, kind of really engaging with non-religious believers. So moving, like really broadening the field. She has been at the forefront of this development. And yeah, she has really shed light on this heterogeneous grouping of sort of so-called unbelievers, shedding light on their worldviews, their motives, and also what she calls existential cultures, what actually kind of aligns them also in some way with people that identify as religious believers. And I think also one thing that really characterizes her work, the last thing I really want to stress, is that I think you've always played on two keyboards. So you had this empirical keyboard, cutting-edge research in this new phenomena, but then also the theoretical keyboard of developing concepts like existential cultures, really doing theoretical work that not only speak to the field of religious studies, but really to our broader discipline. So I think that's really a great way, really a fascinating way of doing sociology. And so we're very eager to hear your talk, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Robert. That was a lovely introduction, and thanks to Patrick Bayet for the invitation to join what looks to me like a very interesting seminar series. I'm assuming if I'm being recorded and told to stand in this spot and do X and Y kinds of dances, that the others are recorded as well. So I might try and see those myself. It seems like a very interesting series of talks, several of which hone in on conceptual issues of conceptual theory, which I will be talking about today. So it might be interesting to know if there are dots to be joined in discussion with you today. I've been really looking forward to talking with you all today. As Robert says, the work is situated more or less in the sociology of religion, if it needs to be situated anywhere. And I've had really interesting conversations around the paper I'll be talking about at the ASA this summer in Montreal, at the BSA. And those conversations have often been within a largely sociology of religion stream. But I think some of the issues that I'm talking about today are relevant to, learn from, have implications for other areas of sociology and social theory and society more broadly. So I'm really looking forward to a conversation with you all today, and I'll leave good time for that conversation. So the sociology of religion without religion. My talk and the paper that I'm revising at the moment on this theme look towards the needs to conduct the sociology of religion without the term religion, and to take seriously concerns that have been very often raised outside of sociology, although sociology has contributed to, and take that as an opportunity then to consider prospects for new sociological concepts and pathways. The sociology of existentiality, which I will advocate for, the sociology of worldview, which is in some ways a parallel, interrelated project which I'll engage with, the sociology of sacrality, which I see as inspiring and instructive in a number of ways, and I've added an appendage for today, the sociology of Santa Claus, a seasonal treat at the end of the talk. I'm going to use some of the work I'm doing in a new paper around Christmas, which thinks about a sociology of Santa Claus today, as a topic that gets at some of the kind of sociological issues, some of the issues of social justice and so on, but perhaps isn't at the sharpest edge of those issues on the chance that anyone's feeling rather fragile this week. So we're going to think about Santa and Christmas as a key example for thinking about what these other areas of sociology might open up. So I'm going to take 3 steps through to that to get to the point of arguing that the sociology of religion and sociology more broadly might be better off without religion as a concept. And those steps are as follows. So firstly, I'm going to talk through a very brief history, of the changing relationship between sociology and religion, which provides the context for this paper, coming to the present day and identifying some ongoing issues. Secondly, I think about the source of those issues, why those issues are extant. So I argue that these concerns, the struggles that sociology continues to have with religion, have to do with the category of religion itself. And thirdly, then look to post-religion approaches, conceptual approaches, set out what those might look like and how they resolve those existing issues, as well as the opportunities they involve for better, more sustained engagement between sociology and the artist or term of art formerly known as religion. And what of a sociology of Santa Claus? How's that going to be appended in? So what I'm going to do is illustrate what I argue for an existential approach to the sociology of religion, or beyond the sociology of religion, with some research I've been doing with Anna Strahan and Rachel Shillitoe at the University of York, which has been working with atheist children who say they don't believe in God, or they're not sure whether they believe in God, and exploring their identities as such. And in that work, we identify Christmas as a key ritual through which children develop their non-religious identities, but also a humanist existential orientation to the world that involves different forms of inclusion and exclusion in that. It's quite charming data. It means we get to hear from some lovely 10-year-olds. It does point, as I say, to some kind of social issues that I think a sociology of existentiality can expose. As I say, not at the very sharpest edge of those. And hopefully we can have that conversation we can think about Christmas sociologically without ruining Christmas for anyone who, like myself, tends to delight in it. So those are our goals. And it is, as Robert said, in a very thorough introduction, very impressed, largely a conceptual and theoretical paper that I'm talking about, but it's shaped by empirical research, especially deriving from the Understanding Unbelief research programme, which I led between 2017 and 2021, and the Explaining Atheism research programme, which we just finished last month, in fact. And those projects explored Understanding Unbelief, tried to understand the nature and diversity of atheism and agnosticism as a global phenomenon. Explaining Atheism then returned to questions of causation, why it is that individuals and societies atheize, become atheist when others do not. But then doing so in light of that richer understanding of what atheism might entail that results from the Understanding Unbelief programme. And those included core research, which I'll speak to, which we undertook in Brazil, China, Japan, Denmark, the UK, and the US. We also funded an additional 40 research projects across these 2 programmes, working across the human sciences and in different parts of the world. And we funded 12 public engagement projects as well, working with partners like the British Library, NatSen, RE Today, and other kind of education organisations, and also photographers and filmmakers. And I've put Aubrey Wade and Bryony Campbell's names there because I've used various images from their projects exploring global atheism and the formation of global atheism in childhood in the UK, in fact, throughout this presentation. And one of those projects that was nested within these broader programmes was about childhood, the Becoming Non-Believer project, which I've already mentioned, and which I became a collaborator in. And if anyone's interested in other parts of that project that I'm not going to speak about today, very happy to. I'm going to mainly focus on the UK, but we might stray into other parts of the world if you're interested to do that. Okay, so sociology and religion. So the context for the set of reflections that I undertake in this paper is the changing relationship between sociology and religion, which will be quite familiar to many of you, and I think could be quite briefly recounted. So we have these three main phases in which sociology is very closely engaged with religion through our friends Weber, Durkheim, Zimmel, and others, but also in what have been called the proto-sociology of various individuals who were religiously motivated in their work prior to those figures. So we see this very close engagement in this sense that religion and society are in some way coterminous, at least tell us something about each other. And this era drafts the secularization paradigm. We then move into this later era in which religion is marginalized. Religion's at the sideline then in mainstream sociology and social theory, and that's very much operating within the secularization paradigm, in which is absolutely taken for granted that religion is declining, is less and less relevant in social life, and therefore as a site or a lens through which to understand the social and undertake social research. And then finally, religion revisited. So from around the 21st century, we see different kinds of challenges to the secularizationist, as it's been termed, idea that religion is largely irrelevant to modern life. So 9/11 is obviously a key moment, but also we have the growth of non-religious populations, which I'll talk a bit about, and religion becomes again a respectable topic for sociology. We get this flurry of publications from leading social theorists, from Beck in 2010, and it's around this time that an increasing number of commentators around 2010, 11, 12, 13 argue that there's a sociology of religion has been reborn, revitalized, it has a renewed status in sociology. We're entering a really dramatically new phase in how sociology engages with religion. But this idea that we've now entered this satisfying era of engagement between sociology and religion has been challenged on a number of fronts. One, the big books dry up, those sort of prominent displays of interest in religion. From that era, as Bruno Latour said, his whole career had been about religion. Everyone was remembering religion. And those kinds of prominent announcements start to dry up. And at very close to the same time in which this new era of engagement with religion is being announced, there are others who are reporting that religion remains very much on the sidelines. And those come from prominent figures like James Beckford, who occupy major roles in the field, presidential roles in the field, who see religion as very much on the sidelines as ever. And there's a consensus that across the field, including those who see this exciting new era of coming into being, that actually we haven't seen any very interesting or innovative social theory that's capable for understanding religion in new ways. So we get to this point that secularization has been dethroned, or at least as a taken for granted theoretical context, but researchers have struggled to think beyond critique, to take up the title of a collection that Baum and Christiane Sturkel published in 2014. So it's quite a moment of excitement that's relatively short-lived. So the argument in this paper is that religion might be the problem. And there are very widespread critiques of the term religion, I think are now sufficiently advanced that we should be circumspect, whether you want to use quote marks with religion, capitalize it when you use the term, or so on. You may not want to do that, but I think there's good reason to be quite careful in our use of the term. And there are three lines of concern, which again I'll talk through quite briefly. One, there's an issue of exclusivity, and the non-religious are going to loom large there. One, there are issues of unequal power arrangements, hierarchies, different forms of injustices and violences that arise therefrom. And then finally, there's an issue of precision, analytic precision. And this, I think, arises, or is at least thrown into clear light by a series of interventions that I talk about as projects of extraction, which work with the sociology of religion and derive some much more analytically precise categories therefrom. So taking those briefly in turn. So one set of reasons why sociology of religion doesn't appear to be fit for purpose is that it's proved insufficiently elastic to stretch to what the field now encompasses. it has conceptually proved unable to recognise the non-religious, to coin a phrase. So that's been my own pathway through to some of these arguments from my doctoral research, to this wider research, this series of wider research programmes that we've been undertaking about these broad populations that were once considered residual to religion, the non-religious, the non-believing, and indeed some of the first sociological meetings in this area were held in these hallowed halls. In fact, in this room, I think the first international meeting about concepts to do with non-religion was held in this room, so you can feel very excited about that. But since then, that's probably about 2010, the field has grown rapidly in tandem with our appreciation that there, as one scholar, Jackie Frost, described it, there's a there. And in that, this mimics the recognition of other normative identity positions that weren't always recognised in sociology and in society as social constructions, normative positions like whiteness, masculinity, and so on. So the non-religious we can think about in those terms. It's not just me that's taken that trajectory, we're finding that much more broadly. So there is a large number of scholars who are now playing with concepts to try and accommodate the non-religious in the sociology of religion broadly understood. So just to take an example, Anne Taves, who's a distinguished professor emerita at UCLA Santa Barbara in religious studies, says, and I'll quote, "While there are many ways we might describe our current situation as scholars of religion, the growing interest in incorporating the study of non-religion and secularity into the academic study of religion stands out and has precipitated a recent shift in my own thinking about the discipline." And we'll meet Anne Taves later, who's taken a lead role in developing Worldview as an alternative conceptual framework. So research in this growing field has documented religious-like aspects of life outside of religious traditions and settings. So it might be, I've taken these images from our project, which are very beautiful, but they're also intended to illustrate things like the ideas, beliefs, philosophies that people have about the nature of their existence and their life. The life cycle rituals, this pair are sitting on a tree above a buried placenta, the life cycle rituals that non-religious people participate in, the way that these aspects of their lives mediate between and structure their relationships. This woman also convenes might be too far. The woman at the far end convenes a meeting group of non-religious individuals, the way how their different identities, perhaps as atheist, perhaps as secular, or perhaps just as not religious, shape their experiences as migrants, say, as gendered and racialized subjects, and so on. So as I said, this mimics or echoes past processes of recognizing other normative identities, whiteness, masculinity, and like those identities, non-religious ones are not always recognized as existing, even by those who hold them. So this research, which is now, as I say, undertaken by hundreds of people around the world, very clearly shows that non-religiosity, secularity in different forms manifests in society as a sociocultural construction of various kinds. None of these are very helpfully described as religious, but it's not clear that there are other kinds of social categories. You might have views on that, and that would be very interesting to know about. It's not clear that existing sociological categories and social categories help describe these phenomena either. And so we get to the religious-like, which is pretty inherently unsatisfying. These conversations are playing out in public life as well, and we see a number of kind of partial pluralisms. So I've drawn out some issues here surrounding the law, inequalities and discrimination, law in particular, which has tried to extend its protections of religious individuals and groups to the non-religious, and one of the major tools it uses for this is extending its framework from religion to religion and belief. But there are ongoing issues and asymmetries here. This is, in any way you work, let's see what we've got. We've got the NHS, we've got a legal firm, we've got Devon County Council. I was just searching for images of the protected characteristics. Absolutely everybody is getting training in our protected characteristics. And you can see here how it uses a world religions paradigm to illustrate religion and beliefs. We've got, I don't know if you can quite see, but we've got sort of familiar images of world religions, and then we have to illustrate everybody else, this symbol, in red for emphasis. There's nothing to see here, there's absolute non-identity. So it should be sort of fairly obvious that that's problematic. There are other asymmetries here too. So the way of framing religion and belief means that quite hard-won legal advances which now protect habitual religious practice rather than just believing don't then extend to protections for the non-religious who have to show, this is where case law is at the moment, who have to show that their beliefs are sufficiently cogent, serious, coherent and important in order for these protections to be extended to them. So ongoing issues there which legal scholars are very aware of, work still needs to be done. But we also see kind of in more everyday attempts at pluralism, a centering of interfaith as that key framework. You may, I imagine most of you will be familiar with this phrase, all faiths and none, which again we have this sort of non-identity and an attempt to build cultural forms of engagement and pluralism with this very imbalanced way of thinking about those identities. Analytically, hopefully the issues here are rather clear. And finally, where we get to in terms of trying to think about non-religious orientations is post-binary approaches to thinking about religion and non-religion, or as Grace Yukich, the president of the Association for the Sociology of Religion, put it, we need to queer the sociology of religion. So these approaches recognise the diverse intersections of non-religious and religious cultures, traditions and identities. Another image from our project. In the UK, the major demographic shift has been from people who identify as Christian to identifying as non-religious. It's the most homogeneously white group within the census, within our social surveys and so on. And as I say, there's a very particular shift that's going on. But even within that, one of the most kind of common cultural constellations that we meet are individuals, or reflecting that perhaps, are individuals who identify as not religious, secular, atheist, whatever it might be, whose outlooks and perhaps some of the ritual practices they call on are humanist, or perhaps they turn to civil ceremonies, whose beliefs about the nature of life might, for example, be humanist, and who are kind of Buddhist curious, which I'm using this image to represent, and who sometimes see Buddhism as not really a religion, other times do see it as a religion, and hold those things very closely together, may undertake particular forms of Christian practice, say, for example, at Christmas. And that constellation of things is not easily described as really religious or really non-religious. So there's a push arising from the sociology of non-religion to take much more seriously those kinds of complex constellations which really define our sociocultural landscapes. Issues of inequality and injustice. Again, there's a diverse set of critical approaches here to think about. They share the view that religion certainly exists as an artifact of discourse and needs to be studied as an object of discourse. And they take different views. So we have the kind of moderate constructionist outlook of someone like Jim Beckford, who's sufficiently interested in religion as an object of discourse. When something's described as religious, it's being described as religious to serve particular interests with particular goals in mind. And that's in itself an important area of social research and something we can focus on. But we also have different critical, the critical religion school, critical secular school that take sharper critical approaches to these concepts. Their concerns are slightly different. So the critical religion school is particularly concerned with how the concept of religion enacts different forms of violence to other groups. And the critical studies school is particularly concerned about the power that the concept of the secular wields over others. But their converge in a number of ways. They both see religion and secular as two sides of a coin. Critical religion school sometimes focuses on non-religion. They both see these concepts as emerging in the modern period, coterminous, they can't exist without each other. They reflect the defining features of modernity, the growth of capitalism, the emergence of the nation state, and so on. And I've pulled that this is very much part of these critiques, but I think it's very significant within these arguments that the post-colonial line of critique needs to be kind of highlighted from within these broader conversations. They both see the language of religion, the language of secularity, as artifacts of empire, as tools of colonialism, and very problematic as a consequence of that. And then the final set of issues has to do with precision. And here I've been quite inspired by what I call these different projects of extraction, which again take different forms. These are just a few examples. In the first place, we have the work of Cécile Laborde, who is Nuffield Professor of Political Theory at Oxford, whose book Liberalism to Religion tries to disaggregate, is the term she uses, the multiple meanings that underlie religion. And so she's interested in the way in which religion acts as a proxy for other things, whether that's, and she's particularly interested in political and legal conceptions, so she's interested in freedom of association, for example, or a term she develops, identity protecting claims that she thinks the law should protect, and does so using the term religion. Then we have people at Antaides who have already met, who are interested, who was initially interested in concepts like specialness, and then that's developed through this kind of neo-Durkheimian project associated with Jeffrey Alexander, Gordon Lynch, Kim Knott, which is thinking about the sacred in this neo-Durkheimian way, in which the sacred is our absolute moral commitments, which are often taken for granted. They're so embedded and so essential to our existence, and become visible most often when they are transgressed through different forms of moral panic and hysteria and so on. So they take from the study of religion this idea of the sacred and show the different kinds of utility of that concept for describing, in Gordon Lynch's work, for example, the sacralization of humanity in the modern period, the sacralization of the nation, the sacralization of the child. And I think these are inspiring and instructive projects, but what's notable is that all of them return to the concept of religion. They all say religion needs to be displaced, and then they find themselves using it again and again and again. And my sense is then that there's still some analytic value or an attempt to use religion in analytic ways, even by those who are taking very seriously this wider critique of the language of religion, as the critical approaches to religion, sorry. Okay, so what should we do? What are we trying to describe then when we do use the word religion that hasn't been recovered through these neo-Durkheimian approaches or discursive studies of religion? And so Antaides, as I say, and a number of other scholars are interested in redefining the field in terms of worldview. So she has a paper called From Religious Studies to Worldview Studies. The same is being advocated, for example, in education, a set of proposals that have been described as a once-in-a-generation set of reforms to education in this country are seeking to reframe the study of religion around the study of worldview. So there's a lot of energy around this concept. And I was talking with Robert earlier about Durkheimian and Weberian approaches to worldview. That's not really happening here. What's happening in this language is a very philosophy-derived, top-down way of thinking about worldview, in which the definition comes down to these sorts of phrases. Worldview is defined in terms of big questions. That's the sort of definition we're getting. And these are the big questions. I don't know if everyone can see that, but they're the big questions of philosophy. Ontological questions, what is ultimate reality, and so on. I talk about existentiality, and I think part of that difference is that it emerges from ethnographic research rather than from philosophy. So it emerges from the conversations that we've been having, diverse conversations and surveying and so on, with people. And so the focus then is on conceptions of existence, or more colloquially, conceptions of life, and how those manifest in ideas, practices, relationships, ethics, aesthetics, whatever it might be. These kinds of questions do come up, but they're interesting to me not because they're big. I don't know that these questions are always the biggest questions to people. If you don't have a roof over your head, are these the biggest questions of the day? I'm not sure they are. Anyway, I think that's an empirical question. But some of these are relevant. Epistemology comes up for some people, issues of the knowledge claims people are making, issues around conspiracy theories and so on. All of these can come into play in people's conceptions of what it means to live and to live well, but they may be more or less relevant at different times or not relevant at all. So, got about, a little bit of time left to talk about Christmas. So to just give a sense of what this might look like, if we think about the sociology of the existential, what kind of becomes visible through that lens. As I said, I'm going to draw on the project, which was initially conducted by Rachel Shillitoe and Anna Strahan, and it led to a couple of papers about the formation of non-religious identities in children in England, and it's based on interviews with children aged between 8 and 11 in 3 schools across England, one of a religious character, 2 non-religious schools. And they've got a book coming out, which I commend to you in the spring, about that formation of non-religious identities. The work I've been doing with them has then been returning to that data set and thinking about, this is part of the Explaining Atheism programme, so thinking about why people become atheist. It's been thinking about whether we're right to think in secularizationist terms about those children as being pushed away from, turned off religion in various ways, or whether we ought better to think of them as being drawn towards new existential movements, new beliefs, cultures, and so on, that are operating in terms of kind of pull factors rather than push factors. And that work has led to this first article, Becoming Humanist, Worldview Formation and the Emergence of Atheist Britain, which highlights the prevalence of humanism in school contexts and home contexts for children, and the importance of that in their becoming, at this age, so middle childhood, humanist in orientation, if not identity. So we're not seeing capital H humanism. Children are identifying this way, but there's a set of beliefs and outlooks that we see as important to children and their sense of self. And then the more recent work, which we're just finalising at the moment, is about Christmas. And specifically the way in which Christmas operates as a key context for processes in the formation of children as humanist. So, and some of it will point to some of the kind of wider implications and sociological questions that arise from thinking about a sociology of the existential. So what does humanist Christmas entail? So of course there's no question that Christmas operates as an existential or worldview ritual of some kind, specifically a Christian kind. And there's also no question that Christmas has burst its banks as an existential or worldview tradition and now has important aspects that are secular or this worldly in nature. Nevertheless, social science has been kind of oddly quiet on, that in itself raises all kinds of questions about capitalism, neoliberalism, all sorts of things. And sociology has been oddly quiet about Christmas despite that, with a few notable exceptions. What we're observing, so this kind of secular, this worldly focus on consumption and so on, focuses on things like feasting, the sacralization of the family, these sort of muscular forms of consumption and consumerism that we think about around Christmas. But what we were observing in this data set was something slightly different. So we're noticing that Christmas mattered to children and parents beyond what any of those frames could help us understand. And especially they conceived of their practicing Christmas and believing in Santa specifically as bound up with their identities as non-religious and non-believers. So Christmas also appeared to be bound up with humanist outlooks that we've identified more broadly in this data, all of which centre on and kind of venerate humanity as a species. So humanist Christmas then celebrates and centres children, those vulnerable humans, the protection of which kind of expresses that valorization of the human species as a whole, and related humanist ethics around human dignity, interspecies superiority, intra-species equality and inclusion. So humanism is really into humans, loves humans. And humanity as a species, I think, is the best way of thinking about it. So we see then Santa, is Santa, by the way, for children. Father Christmas sometimes for parents, but for children it's Santa Claus. Although in my household, my 5-year-old is excited to welcome Santa Christmas, she says. So that transition from perhaps Americanized way of thinking about Santa Claus hasn't fully taken place in our household. So Santa Christmas is then usurping Jesus as a key figure in this child-centred Christmas. And we notice around that and around the conversations, and I'll give you an example in a minute, the importance of evidential reasoning and empiricist thinking that's also important to a humanist outlook, and how that's being practiced and cultivated through these magical beliefs. So against perhaps an intuition in these data, our view is that there are rationalist and empirical epistemologies that are being developed through belief in magical entities and our relationship with magical entities. So here's some lovely children for you. The children were interviewed in pairs. This is Zoe and her friend Louise. Zoe says, oh, and they're being asked about their non-religious identity. What would you tick on a survey? So Zoe says, I think if I had a survey, if there was one that was no religion, then I'd put that because no beliefs isn't exactly true, because I believe in things like Santa and the Tooth Fairy. Louise says, I don't believe in Santa or the Tooth Fairy because... Zoe says, what? You don't? This is very hard data to present if there is a very mixed age audience. Quite happy to see everyone here is over the age of 10, if you don't mind my saying so. Louise, well, I think the Tooth Fairy is probably more likely than Santa, because to go around, even if he literally chucked the presents down the chimney, he still wouldn't be able to get round in time. I know he's magic, but it still doesn't make any sense. So I know, but you know, the night always seems longer when it's Christmas Eve. Maybe he can make the night longer and then go around. Louise, who wants to be a scientist, or maybe, you know, in the winter, it's always a shorter day and it's a longer night. And these kinds of conversations about Santa were just really typical. They were across the data set. Children were never asked about Father Christmas. They were not asked about Santa. They were not asked about Christmas. Parents were asked about Christmas. And this comes up again and again. And this kind of evidential reasoning is prominent. And then what we also see, and parents highlight this especially, is parents are providing evidence. Again, that would be giving the game away to a different audience, but hopefully no surprises here. So they're leaving out carrots and cups of sherry for the reindeer and Santa Claus. They, even in some cases, and I'm not parenting well apparently, leaving snowy footprints. Does anyone do that for their children? Snowy footprints in the hallway. Some parents are. The best of all evidence, of course, is presents in the stocking, which I do. Evidence that someone has visited. But parents also, like children, anticipate that there'll be a point around 9, 10, 11, they're often really specific about that, when children will begin to assess evidence in a different way. Children share that sense. They talk about older children not believing. When I become this age, I won't believe. My big brother has to pretend he doesn't believe because all people his age don't believe, so it'd be very embarrassing. So they're all anticipating this form of transition. And I'll read some of this, sorry, that's small. So this is just to give a sense. This is an interview with Debbie, who's a parent. So she does cultivate these beliefs in Santa or whatever, but she says things like, I think Tim's coming out the other end now, her child. I think he's going to be 9 in the summer, so this is the last Christmas, I think. So there's this really clear sense of the end, what she talks about, the childhood bubble, so the sense of coming out of childhood when you transition out of your belief in Father Christmas. The interviewer, so the interviewer's using this phrase, but she's mentioned it herself. The interviewer notices she's talking about her non-belief in God rather differently to being much more open about her non-belief in God than she is in the way she's talking about Father Christmas. And Debbie reflects, yes, that's interesting. I can see I'm not treating them the same. I can see that. I've said to him, as far as God is concerned, if you want to believe in that, that's fine, but I don't believe. That's a really interesting question, because I can see I'm dealing with both in a very different way. I obviously feel more forcefully about religion and telling him that I don't believe than I do with these things, which I know he'll come out of pretty soon. 8 or 9 years old, sort of that magic of Christmas and Father Christmas and the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny and stuff, he'll naturally come out of that anyway. And I think that's maybe what it is. It's because I know he'll start to realise, and it's just something lovely that we do for children. She talks about being worried that religion isn't something you would come out of naturally, has this different kind of hold. So we're seeing Humanist Christmas, just thinking about those different dimensions to what I'm hoping the concept of the existential can help us to achieve. I think it's much better at helping us understand these non-binary formations that really appear to be the norm in the lives of people. That's borne out by other aspects of the research. We also have explored the kind of major theories for why it is that individuals atheize, and we've surveyed 25,000 people about that and looked at existential security. Is it the case that material security means you have less need for God? Is it about education levels? Is it about analytic thinking? All of these things that people have proposed are associated with atheism. And the data show no real impact, significance of any of those factors. The only thing that appears to matter in terms of predicting whether an individual is going to become atheist or not is whether they're socialised, or they're brought up in a home in which religious practice, it might be mentioned, but it's not visible. So parents might be talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk. That's the outstanding way of predicting whether someone's going to be an atheist or not. We can also see that anti-theistic attitudes in the home correlate, not with atheism. So if your parents are really nonplussed by religion, they're very angry about it, or they think it's very daft, none of that encourages a child to become atheist, but it does make them more likely to hold anti-religious attitudes themselves. All of which is to say that what we're looking at here are processes of cultural change rather than what the secularization theory leads us to expect, a story of decline. It's much better described as a process of existential or worldview cultural change that then makes these kinds of configurations of religious and non-religious cultures absolutely make sense. And so we can think about Christmas in those terms. There's something that's not shorn of its Christian underpinnings, but equally becomes something new in the lives of these children. Tells us something about modernity too, and theories around the decline of religion. So Christmas is something that we experience as a ritual that has these strong practice elements, but also has a distinctive emotional repertoire, as well as a set of ideas about what it is to live a good life. That challenges the idea that we have all over the shop, that modernity involves the disappearance of rituals. In a recent example, Anthony Giddens, I'm told I'm a real sociologist if I cite Anthony Giddens, tick, views rites of passage as something that are absent in modernity. Individuals are left without structured ways of coping with the business of living. Or Osborne, who in the invention of ritual sees this rapid period in which rituals are invented that's associated with accelerated periods of urbanisation and industrialisation, but thinks in no way does that keep pace with the decline of ritual. So again, modernity is again and again about the decline of ritual and rites of passage. And we're not seeing that in these data. If we think about the debates that are had every year about Christmas creep, to quote Richard Curtis, Christmas really is all around. So if we're thinking about Christmas as what sociologists of non-religion have done is turn to explicitly existential rituals. They're interested in funerals, especially how we memorialise the dead, to a lesser extent in marriages, not very much in naming ceremonies and rituals around birth. I think there's probably a feminist account we can make of that, but they turn to these life cycle rituals. But what we're seeing in this work is the way in which the rituals that we are all participating with can be thought of as having important existential dimensions, which mean that those existential rituals and rites of passage are kind of hiding in plain sight. And as we've seen, there's ways in which it's operating as a rites of passage as well, that parents and children see themselves as moving through their experiences of Christmas into a phase of maturity. And then they become kind of elders of this tradition. So you discover the terrible, bleak truth that Father Christmas doesn't exist, or Santa Claus. But you might then be asked to protect the younger siblings in the household, or to protect younger children from that. You are now an elder of this tradition, and you can become a ritual provider like your parents. And hopefully, parents hope, retain a sense of magic that's been developed and cultivated through that earlier period of engagement with magical entities. And let's talk briefly about the exclusivity of what's been talked about as the aggressive inclusivity of Christmas, which actually, thinking about Christmas as a humanist festival, helps to make sense of, since this kind of aggressive inclusivity is a very humanist. We're all humans, we must all participate. That kind of ethic of inclusion, which does some very beautiful things, has this aspect to it, which I recognise. And it's not always inclusive, as the image perhaps indicates. And there are diverse forms of Christian privilege that we definitely see in schools, but also humanist privilege in schools. Children are quite aware that there are forms of difference that can become visible around Christmas, that there are children who don't practice Christmas. They practice Eid, which is sometimes seen as mutually exclusive. So we're getting this very early sense of Muslims as other that has to do with these different practices. My daughter in primary school is learning about Diwali, and she learns about the Hindus that practice that, whereas Christmas is universalised and naturalised in a way. Christmas is for everybody. It has nothing to do with her identity, her position at all. And here's a quote again from Debbie, who we've already met. And she recounts this story, which she thinks the interviewer will have heard, because it's something obviously looms large in her memory. I'm wondering whether somebody's mentioned it actually. So there were a couple of families, and this one family in particular, who've since moved away, and they're very religious. I'm not quite sure what denomination, I'm not sure what element they believed in, but it's quite strict. The interviewer clarifies, Christian? Yeah. They don't believe in Father Christmas, you know. The children don't. So as soon as the children can understand the difference between believing and not believing, here the non-believer is very much in Father Christmas. So the humanist children are here the believers. Between believing and non-believing, they told the children, Father Christmas doesn't exist. Christmas itself, Christmas is about Jesus and what happened here. So they do all, in terms of Christmas, they do everything, but they miss out the Father Christmas part. So this little boy came into school, and I think it was like year 1 or 2, they're literally 6 or 7 years old, and told all the children, Mummy tells me that Father Christmas doesn't exist because of this, this, and this. And actually some parents, and I can see their point, some parents were really quite cross because their children were coming home with the magic kind of having gone. Some parents were quite cross that it happened. I was a bit more laissez-faire, saying, well, you know, it's what they believe in, it's what they believe. You know, we understand that. But it's a shame. It's a shame this little boy has come into school, you know. One doesn't get the feeling that the family were missed. And elaborating on this later, this is Debbie's vision of the community. Are you aware of tensions and disagreements between parents when it comes to matters of religious or non-religious identity and spirituality? Remember, none of these interviews really had to do with Christmas. This is being brought to us. So Debbie says, no, I don't think so. I think the community we live in, I think they feel very similarly to me. I mean, aside from that family I spoke about who have since moved away, there was one other family I know that's very religious that go to a different school. There are 2 families in Tim's year, her child, who I believe are Jehovah's Witnesses. So when it comes to praise assemblies and anything to do with Christmas, they just sit out. They don't take part in that whatsoever. I wouldn't say there are any tensions at all, probably curiosity, I think. And so this is the kind of vision of inclusivity, and that's the journey that you kind of get to, and that children are being inculcated into to get to this benign curiosity. So I'm coming to a conclusion. Much of what we have to say about Christmas was anticipated by Claude Lévi-Strauss in his first article, published after he completed his PhD in 1951, Father Christmas Executed, which has quite an interesting story, which I don't have time to go into, but can if you would like to know more. And he argues also, he's focused on secularity rather than humanism per se, but he also notices that Father Christmas is not a figure that's preserving a Christian form of Christmas, but is rather a direct threat to Christian Christmas. He notices too the way that Christmas rituals cultivate and advance secularity. Father Christmas myths, in his vision, operate as an initiation ritual, as they do for us, into, he particularly focused on a hierarchical relationship between parents and children, which I think is quite different now, and the way in which it allows children to make demands on their parents for this one day of the year, albeit on the agreement that they then follow the parents' behavioural code for all the other days of the year. So he's interested in how Christmas is constructing this new kind of moral code that's associated with secular and anti-Christian ways of thinking. We think that an appreciation of humanist existential traditions that undergird contemporary forms of Christmas deepen these observations and help explain the kind of profound and growing hold that this culture has. Sociology, I don't think, has reflected, as he invites us to quite sweetly, on the tender precautions and sacrifices that we make to keep his Father Christmas's prestige intact for children. And we explain that in relation to religionist and secularization focuses on sort of obsession with religion and a failure to treat non-religious worldviews or existential traditions in similar terms. So, I agree. David said, to be a real sociologist of religion, you've got to reference Giddens and Grace Davey. So let's end with Grace Davey, who is a sociologist of religion, some of you will know. I agree with her when she says that empirical religion is not, quote, something that can be safely or sensibly relegated either to the past or to the edge. That's from 2013. And yet that occurs again and again and again. I think the problem is, paradoxically, the persistence of religion-centric ways of thinking about our subject matter, a persistence that we can understand as an artefact of fairly benign aspects of Western cultural history that have brought us to the present day, but also of much more malignant, colonial, racist aspects of that history. So then replacing religion with existentiality is an attempt to flatten hierarchies that have defined this aspect of society and sociology, persisting beyond the collapse of other hierarchies in social theory. I've spoken about terminology around gender, around race and ethnicity. As we know all too well from those areas, critical approaches to concepts do not immediately lead to the collapse of hierarchies and end diverse forms of violence that operate across those hierarchies. But where they do exist and are embedded in conceptual forms, it's surely helpful and probably a necessary condition to widen our forms of critique. So the call to move beyond religion is a contribution to these kinds of critical projects. The new language is an attempt to be inclusive of non-religious experience, to challenge hierarchies between religious and secular, which operate both ways. There are times at which the religious occupy the elevated position in those hierarchies. There are times in which the secular exist in that position. But to create political, legal, and community frameworks that are equally able to provide for traditional and emerging existentialities, and for those that are not represented by dedicated institutions, as well as those that are. It's an attempt to develop an analytic language that's more precise and sensitizes us to the significance of existentiality in our life, which, like Christmas, might be hiding in plain sight. And there are interesting connections to explore between, for example, sociology and legal theory that arise. Just examined a PhD by Kim Harding about vegan studies and the way in which ethical vegans feel protected by that language of belief in the law and don't feel protected, and so on. A really interesting project which shows how these kinds of ideas can be applied. Or engagements with Patrick Bayet's work around existential in sociology, that think about using milestones through life as a way of understanding what counts as a good life or just what life ought to look like, which sometimes has those existential, in my sense, dimensions to it. And it helps us develop theoretical approaches beyond secularization, which are better able to grapple with the transformations of our existential traditions and landscapes without becoming consumed, as we have been, with the traditional religious worldviews within that landscape, but instead allow us to learn from everything we know about those historic existential traditions in order to illuminate contemporary ones. Okay, I will end there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. I think it's been 10 years since you've been here.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Please do come again sooner than that next time. And yeah, thank you all for being here. Thank you. Thank you.